Is the Game Boy Advance really that powerful? Insanely powerful? Well, yes it is, I would say so when you consider when it came out, how much it cost, its battery life, and well, just the fact that this is Nintendo who we're talking about, for whom raw power was not always a priority. Yes, this was the Game Boy's final form, and it was a heck of a machine when it first emerged in 2001. This was originally intended to be a GBA versus SNES thing, but there really is no comparison. The Game Boy Advance is way more powerful than the Super NES in nearly every way. Nearly, we'll get to its shortcomings. But before that, a quick word from today's sponsor, PCBWay. Yes, the one and the only, your one-stop shop for PCB manufacture, 3D printing, CNC machining, injection moulding, assembly, all kinds of services. If you're a fan of classic gaming, you'll know that messing around with the original hardware is tons of fun, and PCBWay has your back here with a whole load of ready-to-go retro projects shared on its website. Like this Game Boy Advance Power Cleaner. What on earth does that do? Well, it gives some much needed noise reduction to the GBA's sound output. And you'll be surprised at just how inexpensive it is to get going with custom PCBs. Prices start from $5, and with a $5 coupon for all new users, you might find your first project costs you next to nothing. Anyway, thank you PCBWay, hit up that link in the description if you'd like to know more. Every sort of PCB imaginable could be yours for a very reasonable price. That's PCBWay, a company that I'm always very happy to promote. Now back to the issue at hand, the Game Boy Advance. And yes, I do have a cold at the moment, but let's just crash on regardless. The Game Boy Advance, though brimful with pocket power, it was never going to have the capabilities of something like the PlayStation. It just doesn't have the 3D acceleration for a start, but it was a good bit ahead of anything from the 16-bit era when it comes to computing capability. No surprise then, it saw a lot of SNES ports and sequels and remakes of games from the 16-bit era of just a few years prior to its launch. It could easily handle even the most demanding games of this type, Donkey Kong Country being one example of many. The CPU at the heart of this system is an ARM 7TDMI, the ancestor of the processors you'll find in nearly all of today's mobile devices. Primitive compared to what you'd get in a modern smartphone, of course, but at least a couple of generations ahead of what you'd find in either the Super Nintendo or the Mega Drive, and better in every way. Although capable of running in either 16 or 32-bit modes, the GBA spent most of its time as a 16-bit system, strictly speaking, because of memory bandwidth constraints, but still its high clock speed and modern features meant that this CPU could do a lot. I'm not going to get too bogged down in specs and numbers, but the GBA had the power for workloads that older systems would find impossible. Yoshi's Island is an excellent example. The SNES original required the Super FX chip to run, basically another CPU built into the cartridge that handled things like sprite scaling and rotation, but the GBA could do this natively without any extra help, no problem, mostly. The GBA's lower resolution screen means that things are a little zoomed in and also a bit brighter too, and higher contrast. Though this wasn't a technical constraint, many GBA games went for a lighter colour palette to account for the non-backlit screen that the earlier models had. There is one effect in Yoshi's Island that the GBA seems to struggle with, and that's the infamous touch fuzzy get dizzy freakout. Yes, this is what the SNES version looks like, but its appearance on the handheld version is a bit more muted. Why is this? Well, the SNES graphics processing system had one thing that the Game Boy Advances lacked, what was called offset per tile mode. Basically, this allowed vertical strips of the background to be scrolled individually. The Game Boy Advance was forced to fake this for the foreground by rather cleverly switching between two background layers set at different heights relative to Yoshi. They didn't really attempt to do anything at all with the other layer that swirls around on the Super NES. Maybe they thought it was too much trouble, or maybe they were just worried about the effects of flashing imagery. I do believe this part was toned down on the Super NES Classic Edition version 2 because of these concerns. Anyway, this is a totally minor point that I only put in for accuracy's sake. In every other way, the GBA PPU was way more capable than the SNES one, as many games show souped up successors to 16-bit titles. It could handle 4 separate 256 colour backgrounds at once, 128 256 colour sprites up to 64 by 64 pixels, with 30 of them able to be rotated and scaled. You could easily fill up the entire screen with sprites without flicker. It can also rotate and scale backgrounds like the SNES Mode 7, but more so. Affine transformation is the technical name for this type of thing, and the GBA could have either 2 separate affine layers at once, or 1 affine layer and 3 normal backgrounds. This means you could have stuff like what we see here in Konami Crazy Racers, with a rotating background over the top of another layer we can see beneath it. It could even go one stage further and add some transparency effects, like in this totally not Rainbow Road inspired course appearing translucent over the spacey background. You really could not do this on the SNES, no way. Mode 7 is much more limited. Another thing the Super NES couldn't do are these 3D worlds in Sonic Battle, the underloved Sonic fighting game. Here we've got 2 affine layers acting in tandem, one for the floor and one for the tops of the obstacles in the arena, whilst the walls are done with scaled sprites, and it looks quite nice. It also nicely brings us to the whole world of 3D, something that the GBA was not really made for but ended up doing quite a lot of. First off, let's talk Doom. It seemed quite impressive when it appeared on the Super NES in 1995, an impossible port made possible by the Super FX chip once again. Or I should say the more powerful Super FX2. It wasn't the best version of Doom, not by a long way. It was sort of playable and, well, not bad compared to most other attempts to bring this type of game to 16-bit machines, but not that great either. 6 years later, the GBA version, well, it's also far from perfect, but it is better. It's fully textured, the SNES version was missing the ceiling, it runs better, and the monsters aren't always facing you either. It might not satisfy hardcore Doom enthusiasts, there's probably still some out there, but for the first portable version of Doom, it's not bad. Okay, if you had very deep pockets, literally as well as figuratively, you might have already seen Doom on some sort of palm-top PC or PDA, but not one that's quite easily literally fit in your pocket, cost 80 quid and ran for 15 hours on 2 AAs. Yes, it was a minor miracle to see this running on this back then, but there is so much more we could look at. Moving on to polygonal 3D as opposed to the ray casting of Doom, well, let's have a look at Star Fox 2 on the SNES for comparison's sake. It didn't officially come out till 2017 on the SNES Classic, of course, though the beta leaked years before. It is, though, the best proper 3D game for the system, no question. It even has rudimentary texture mapping. Again, this uses the Super FX2 to actually draw the 3D graphics, and well, the frame rate isn't great, but it is a totally playable game. Sadly, this was never ported to the GBA. That would have been great, wouldn't it? But no, but can the GBA match it in performance though? Oh yes, absolutely. The problem is where to start. Well, let's bring out the big guns right away and go straight for Driver 3. Is this a good game to play? Not really, but technically, wow. This is a full-on 3D open-world action game on the Game Boy Advance. Yeah, the frame rate is low, the graphics pop-in is ludicrously high, the textures are wonky, but, well, wow. A real open world game on a handheld console that came out in 2001 and cost $100. You can pay that much for a controller these days. From here, there's a huge list of games doing stuff in 3D that the SNES or any other 16-bit system would never be able to cope with at all. No matter what, we're in a different league now. Asterix and Obelix XXL is a 3D platforming brawler set in fairly large environments featuring who else but those ancient Gaulish Rome resistance fighters. If you really squint, it could almost be a PlayStation game, but you would have to squint a lot. Yeah, it's not Spyro the Dragon, it's certainly not Banjo-Kazooie, but it is amazingly ambitious, and I can't believe they pulled it off on this system, more or less. V-Valley 3 is another one, a full-on polygonal 3D rally game. It doesn't match what you'd see in a real full-fat 32-bit home system, but damn, once again, this is impressive for such a restricted system. Especially considering how well, let's say modest the previous entry in the Game Boy line had been. The Game Boy Color wasn't much more than a minor bump from the original Game Boy and was left behind by the competition technically, though it still had insane success, of course. This here is Duke Nukem on the Game Boy Color, and this is Duke Nukem on the Game Boy Advance 3 years later. It really is a world away, isn't it? But if you really want to see some crazy impressive stuff, well, maybe we should talk about emulation, because, well, the GBA was just about viable as a portable emulation system. It could run a few emulators, let's say, acceptably well enough to be enjoyable even today if you don't have too high expectations, and going back to the early 2000s, this capability was pretty jaw-droppingly unprecedented. NES emulation, thanks to Pocket NES, is not flawless, but it's got very high compatibility and a large number of games run pretty nicely. Yes, you can enjoy games like Crisis Force and River City Ransom in a pretty decently playable form. The big problem is resolution mismatch. The GBA's screen resolution doesn't fit well with the NES's. It's got to be squashed or scaled or something. A bit of experimentation with the settings though, and most games can look okay. What else can we emulate? Well, how about the Game Boy with Goomba Color? Wouldn't that be totally pointless though, given that the GBA has full Game Boy compatibility built in? Well, no, for a few reasons. First off, not all Game Boy Advance models actually have original Game Boy compatibility. The Game Boy Micro didn't, and this allows you to play these games on that system. Also, it allows you to run Game Boy ROM files off a standard GBA flash card, something that would otherwise be impossible, and you can have all the benefits of emulation like save states. Not only that, you can even enable some Super Game Boy features. Compatibility still isn't totally perfect. Some Game Boy Color games won't work properly, but this works even better than NES emulation. No scaling needed to fit things in, but we can go even further than that. Dr. SMS gives us a pretty respectable Sega Master System emulation too, allowing a reasonable recreation of Sonic and all those other classics. It won't make you chuck out your Game Gear, but not bad at all for the early 2000s. There really wasn't much else at all that could even begin to do this back then. And this stuff was available then if you had a flash card. I'm not just looking at recent homebrew developments, these are emulators that came out when the GBA was still on the market, and I remember enjoying them all myself way back then with my own GBA. Things do go downhill from here though as we try to emulate more powerful systems. The PC Engine is sort of playable with some games, but far from an ideal experience. It does have sound, but you're better off without it really, and switching it off improves performance. Still though, I'm amazed that this is even remotely possible. I could say the same about the GBA's attempts to emulate the competition too, or what passed for competition in this utterly Nintendo-dominated field then as now. In Japan, Nintendo's portable system faced off against the Neo Geo Pocket and the Bandai WonderSwan, and well, my word, the GBA can sort of emulate both of them. This is the Neo Geo Pocket and it is the best of the two, though you wouldn't want to play any games this way really, but it just goes to show how powerful the Game Boy Advance was compared to what came before. This goes double for the WonderSwan. The few compatible games run glacially, but as a proof of concept, it is impressive. Just imagine if somebody today released a handheld that could emulate the Switch. That definitely hasn't happened though. That would make Nintendo sad, and they'd probably have to allegedly resort to shutting down YouTube videos that talk about it. Anyway, there's one last emulator that I want to look at, and well, here it is. It's the Super NES. Indeed, it's a little bit glitchy, I will warrant. Apart from the fact that the Game Boy Advance has fewer buttons than the Super NES, there's a few other things you might complain about. If you're a Super Nintendo purist, you might notice something amiss here and there, but hey, it is running. Yeah, emulating Donkey Kong Country is, well, more than a little bit silly, as there's already a perfectly good port of it on the system, but this emulator doesn't run that many games, and this is one of the better looking ones, believe it or not. This absolutely seals the deal, though, about how they compare in terms of power. If the Game Boy Advance can emulate the Super Nintendo even a bit, it's just got to be more powerful. That's the way things are. To emulate a system, you need to convert the game or program's binary code from the original into something the host system can execute in real time on the fly, and this adds an overhead that you can only really overcome with more computing power. So that's it. This is why there is no comparison between the Super Nintendo and the Game Boy Advance. One can sort of emulate the other. But there is one other fly in the ointment we probably need to talk about. There is, I'm afraid to say, no sound on this emulator, is there? Yes, this is, I'm sure you'll agree, complete silence. You probably would have taken my word for that, but anyway, this is one area of the SNES's capabilities that the Game Boy Advance will never be able to fully recreate, not completely. It can do better than silence, as the many official Super NES ports show, but it can't sound quite as good. Why is that? Well, to break it down, both systems use sample-based PCM audio processors. The difference is in the quality. The Super NES plays back audio with a sample rate of 32 kHz and a bit depth of 16 bits. The Game Boy Advance also has a sample rate of 32 kHz, but a bit depth of just 8 bits. Now, this isn't quite the same thing as 8-bit and 16-bit processors, but if you're thinking that 16 bits is better than 8 bits, well then you're on the right lines. What you are hearing right now is dropped down into 32 kHz 16-bit audio like what the Super NES has in my editing software, and you probably can't hear much, if any, difference from the usual audio quality. This, though, is what it sounds like in 8-bit Game Boy Advance audio quality. Yes, it's noticeably worse, isn't it? In fact, it's pretty awful. Let's go back to normal, shall we? To really simplify things, bit depth has an impact on the signal-to-noise ratio. An 8-bit sampled audio is never going to sound as good as 16-bit sampled audio, other things being equal. And for the Game Boy Advance, it's often even worse than this. You see, the system, unlike the Super NES, didn't have its own dedicated audio processor. A lot of the work has to be done by the main CPU, so many games dropped the audio quality even further to stop it impacting the frame rate. There's more to this story that I'm leaving out, but if you think the Game Boy Advance sounds worse than the SNES, then you aren't wrong, and this is a big reason why. The GBA had enough space in its cartridges and just enough processing power to simply play back loops of pre-recorded audio in sort of okay quality, which many games did because that's the easiest option. This led many game soundtracks to be just tinny snippets repeating endlessly, like the awful din that this otherwise technically impressive game smashing drive produces. Add on top of this the crappy speaker and the electrical noise the system generates, and well, it doesn't add up to great audio, even if you use headphones. But outside of this sound quality issue, and outside of minor points like the offset per tile stuff and the, okay, not totally minor but not huge point of lower screen resolution, the Game Boy Advance absolutely smashes the Super Nintendo. Here is yet more proof. This is Jim Bagley's Virtua Fighter clone demo. It's far from a complete game, but wow, it's even got some lighting effects in the form of Garou shading. This is the same guy who ported Dragon's Lair to the ZX81, so he's got form. But anyway, moving on, I should also mention for completion's sake, Doom. Haven't we already seen this? Well, we have, sort of, but this is a new attempt to bring it to the Game Boy Advance. Actually, a port of the PCBWay open source Doom engine. It brings even more features of Doom to the Game Boy Advance and runs a bit better too. I will put a link in the description to the project page. And finally, how on earth could I leave this out? This huge recent development in GBA wonderment, a port of OpenLara, the open source Tomb Raider engine. Yeah, this is still just an alpha version, but well, this really is something else. In the past, you might have said a lot of Game Boy Advance games were competing for the crown of the best looking 3D title on the console, but this one easily cruises into first place. It looks absolutely superb, doesn't it? It's even got a handy frame counter to let us know that the frame rate is actually quite decent too. At least for a 3D Game Boy Advance game. It's a fully textured 3D world with lighting and a reasonable draw distance, and if this doesn't prove the potential power of Nintendo's last of the Game Boy line, well, I don't know what will. So that's the GBA, more powerful than the Super NES? Absolutely it is. In classic style 2D gaming, or in 3D, it beats Nintendo's 16-bit system by a long way, and it manages to be a real mini beast that still somehow had amazing battery life and a genuinely pocket form factor, no matter which version of the hardware you had. The system's life was really quite short, at least its life as Nintendo's flagship handheld, being replaced by the DS after just 3 years. Maybe we never saw it being pushed just as hard as it could have been, with new hardware taking its place so quickly. It's enjoyed quite a big homebrew following over the years, quite a bit of stuff has come out for it as we've seen, but I can't help but think even this has been reined in a bit by the popularity of the PSP's homebrew scene. The PSP really took over as the major hub for handheld homebrew software very quickly. Of course, more powerful systems soon came along. The Nokia Engage took the crown as the most powerful handheld just 2 years later, but to be fair, that was awful, and it was 3 times the price. But then of course the DS happened, and well, that's just another story entirely. So anyway, that's the end of that. Another 20 minutes of your life gone, wasted, listening to me waffle on with a cold this time, but, well, I enjoyed it, even if you didn't. Thanks as ever to my really wonderful Patreons. If you would like to be numbered amongst them, that really would be fantastic. There's a link below, and I will say thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time, folks.